Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Abuse Recovery Success. I could not be more excited to have the guest that we have today, and I know that you guys probably hear me say that a lot, but I really mean it this time. I've got a guest that is actually my therapist, but I should introduce her formally as Krystal Mazzola. She's a best-selling author, a licensed marriage and couples therapist, as well as family, and she's also here with us because she helps people through codependency. She's a recovery coach. So there's so many hats that Krystal wears, and the reason I invited her to be a guest today is because I really want to emphasize that I take mental health extremely seriously. It's been a big part of my journey and my road to recovery. So without further ado, welcome Krystal to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm so excited that you invited me. I think it's wonderful, April, that while I would never disclose anything about our work or, that I'm your therapist, I think it's wonderful that you want to destigmatize mental health and recovery. And so when you invited me to be on your podcast, I was really excited.
I love that you just said destigmatize, because so much of this podcast is about shattering stigmas and the shame that we all carry with us. I think whether you're a listener listening because of trauma, abuse, codependency, recovery, we can feel a lot of shame associated with that. And it really takes effect in our lives. So I really wanted Krystal to come on today and really share with you what she does in her work and really why you got started. So if you could share with the listeners how you got started and part of your journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, April. So I always say that therapists become therapists for a reason, and I'm no exception. So kind of like the long and short of it, I was born to a mom who dropped out of high school. She was a teenager when she had me. I was born into poverty there. Mm-hmm. And then when I was about 3 years old, she met my ex-stepfather, who was an alcoholic. So I grew up in a very classically alcoholic, abusive home, which, for anyone who's familiar with codependency is a very standard way of becoming codependent. So growing up in an alcoholic home. So that was always secretive, the alcoholism. I remember having to hide that, and my family really taught me not to air dirty laundry. And so I think I overperformed really as a student. I was always burying myself in my grades, in my schoolwork, and I went to a school with a lot of expectations and homework, always kind of like on track for college preparation. And so there was always a lot of homework that I could bury myself into, but there were a lot of abusive dynamics that I still couldn't really escape. So my grandmother lived with us as well. And when I look back, so, I can't diagnose anyone in my family. Yeah. But when I look back, it really looks to me as if all the caregivers in my life, my grandmother, my mother, and my ex-stepfather, who raised me, were all had symptoms of personality disorders. Wow. So I would say that my mother and my ex-stepfather were more classically narcissistic, whereas my grandmother was more borderline. And so my mom really spent her life, and she'll even admit this, really being preoccupied with my grandmother and trying to satisfy her. And so my brother and I kind of got lost in all of that. It was always about my grandmother's needs, keeping my ex-stepfather happy because he paid for everything. And then I was the overperformer. And so I really, though, kind of got all of the family's attention. Yeah. I was both at times the hero and the scapegoat. So what that means is that I would get a lot of praise for my academic performance, but then I was always the scapegoat. So if something went wrong, I was the person to blame. So if any of our listeners are kind of wondering what their family roles are, it's kind of like the scapegoat is the person who, no matter what, they're the problem. So that often happens with the addict in the family, but it can be other people as well. And so, a perfect example from my own life is I remember vividly, I would be in my room doing my homework, and my mom would run in and yell at me that my grandmother and her were fighting because of me. And I was just in my room doing homework. And so, if anyone's listening and they're like, oh, I wonder if that was me. If you felt blamed all of the time for things that weren't your fault, you were probably the scapegoat. And it's incredibly painful.
It is.
It is. And so there was a lot of abuse in the home with my ex-stepfather, who was also incredibly depressed. He would often threaten suicide in front of my brother and I remember having to beg him to not complete suicide, which is kind of set me up for a lot of codependent patterns. So I always say I'm in recovery for codependency, PTSD, and depression. Yeah. And so with my codependency, when early in my life, in my 20s, I dated a man who would constantly threaten suicide in front of me as well.
It's crazy how
so who was an alcoholic.
Yeah,
exactly. We kind of
search that out.
Yeah, our brain is actually driven to recreate trauma as a way of reprocessing it. Unfortunately, all it does is re-traumatize us. Yeah. But in our brain, we're driven to kind of like, for example, in my own life, I felt like if this alcoholic, suicidal man picked me and wanted to be with me, then all of the trauma in my childhood would kind of be erased. Yeah. Of course, it doesn't work that way, but that's kind of what our brain thinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then kind of going back, really, I actually lived at home with my family until after my undergrad years. I was raised in like an Italian-Mexican home, so like family's really important. So I was kind of in that longer than average. But I also felt a lot of responsibility to stay at home. And my mother finally divorced my ex-stepfather when I was 18. And he was, there were like lots of abuse in the home. And so then she met her now husband, who was also very abusive. He's much more emotionally abusive and like cold, but just lots of abusive men in my experience in my family. So there's a lot there. My way of kind of coping with things, first and foremost, as I said, I really put myself into my schoolwork to get some sort of value, to get some sort of sense of control. I could control that. But looking back, I did know that my suicidal thoughts and my depression first entered my life when I was 11. So I really struggled with depression severely for about 20 years. And, in some of my darkest years, I could always work. Like I could always function enough to get to work because I always got a lot of meaning out of my work, and I'll talk a little bit more about my recovery and what my work means to me. So, even before I went to grad school, I worked for an AIDS service organization, and I could go to work. I could help. I worked in prevention, actually, for suicide prevention and HIV prevention for youth back then. But then I would come home, and I remember for hours I would have to fight suicidal ideations. Yeah. And I really coped by just kind of losing myself in the sadness. Sometimes I would binge drink, but that was more to deal with my codependency because in my codependency, I felt driven to spend time with men that I didn't like to get a sense of approval or validation. And so I would have to get drunk to be around them and to kind of perform for them. Yeah. But I know addiction isn't really something that I don't identify as in recovery for.
It's not like your first thing that you have to recover from. But I have a question before we move on too far ahead. Because I like that you were talking about the roles, because I think that's what a lot of the listeners and what we get from feedback is people, they struggle with that family dynamic and where they've been categorized. And it's really no wonder at 11 years old, you're having suicidal thoughts when you're trapped in this madhouse, for lack of better words. But can I ask, if you're comfortable, what happened with your brother's role? And, are you close to him today? Like, what was his... because the poor guy was going through all that with you. Yeah.
I appreciate you asking. There's definitely parts of his story that I don't feel I have the right to share. And I don't know if where he's at with his healing. My brother and I have a relationship, but it's not nearly as close as I wish. I think that really the trauma of our childhood, we dealt with it in very different ways. So for me, that makes sense. I dove into the darkness, I dove into the sadness, and he really went into like a superficial place. Sure. And so in his life, he's still very much in a place of really only being obsessed with his working out, and he works and dating and not really feeling
processing necessarily everything.
He's not really processing. And so I really hope for more healing for him, but he really coped with it just by not going deep, not even wanting to look at it, not being open to therapy, things like that. Of course I've provided supportive conversations to him, but he's not really receptive to that. So unfortunately, I feel like until we can have more of those heartfelt, authentic conversations, I'll never be as close to my brother as I'd like. Yeah. And that brings me a lot of sadness that, he's the only person who lived in that home with me. And I can't be close to him still.
Yeah. That's awful.
Because we coped in it with such different ways.
Yeah.
And so my brother's still, I would say he's still very much lost.
Yeah.
You know, he was lost in the family system in the sense like he was just ignored.
Yeah.
You know, and he was acting out, you know, like I look back and he had some self-harming behaviors and everyone was just, it was like a joke. No one like really saw him. It was just, and so I think that he just kind of coped by staying away from heaviness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, because what happens to me is whenever anyone's telling their story on this podcast, it's like I always go to that just place of genuine deep sorrow for the little person in that situation and what they went through. So as you were walking through it, you know, I was able to kind of see where you were at, and then I you know, I got curious about that. But tell me, like, for the dynamic, I think, you know, you had this, I guess if it's okay if I ask, do you still have the stepfather? I mean, I would imagine he's completely gone now and you guys don't. So if there's a listener right now in a similar situation than you, like what would be, you're going to talk more about the recovery process and all that, but just while we're in that moment, what would you tell them as they're going through this dynamic, whether they're your role, your brother's role, whatever space they are, but they're someone in that?
In a system
that
where
toxic family environment,
within a stepfather. Yeah, it's really interesting because in my own life, I didn't know my biological father. And so that complicated it. And so if they do have a biological father who is at all of a healthy support for them, maybe they can't save them from that situation, you know, I would encourage them to notice the positives in that father's relationship that they do have and to enjoy some of the safe support or respite that they get if they do get to see their father sometimes, if they're still growing up. If they're an adult and they have that relationship, then I am so happy for them that they have some sort of example of a positive male fatherly relationship in their life. And I would encourage them to remember that their stepfather doesn't define their entire experience with men. Because I think that in codependency, we get kind of cut off sometimes from that gender that most abused us or in trauma. And then that really complicates our relationships with them, whether it's friendship or romantic or sexual. And so, but if they're really like me, if they really don't have that biological father and their stepfather is abusive, or maybe both men are abusive in their lives, the thing that I most want to emphasize for them is that it's not their fault. And as painful as it is, it's not personal. That one of the most painful and sad things that happens when we go through so much trauma is that we make up it's because of us. You know, I used to make up that because I didn't know my real father and my ex-stepfather was so abusive towards me that something had to be wrong and broken about me. And I really want to emphasize to any listener who can relate to me at all that it took me so much work to actually believe it, but I'm telling you it's the truth, that this has nothing to do with your worth and value in this world, and that you are amazing and incredible, and sometimes we are just born into families with parents who cannot celebrate us. And that is not your fault. That is the most important thing to me to share.
That is the most important thing to me too. I'm getting all broken up because it's just, and we talked about this in a previous episode. It's just, I don't know. I mean, listen, there's a lot of people that suffer addiction and they didn't go through a trauma. And maybe they had a picture perfect household. You know, what is picture perfect? And, you know, I'm always saying normal, throwing that word around. But at the end of the day, trauma and these dysfunctional relationships and family upbringings are such a springboard and a launching for a lot of issues down the road, whether that is depression or, you know, addiction. And it is that just innate feeling of feeling like there is something wrong about you. And I think, you know, a lot of our work together has helped me try to remember that there is nothing wrong with me. But let's talk about that and your recovery and how, you know, you work with others so that they can find that self-worth.
Yeah. So with my own recovery, so it really started, I was always looking for answers. So around the same time that I became suicidal, I also started connecting with my spirituality. And so I started kind of looking for answers, and I dove into really studying world religions and metaphysical belief systems. And so while I was growing up, that helped me. That would kind of provide an anchor for me. So I kind of knew that there was some more purpose out there, that there was hope out there. I wouldn't say that I relied heavily on prayer or anything like that. Just kind of knowing that there was maybe a bigger picture, that kind of was grounding for me.
Sure.
And then really, I didn't really feel the depth of my pain until my 20s when I left my family home. And so during that time, I found therapy, of course. I found Reiki, which was incredibly helpful to me. I also had a pet that, meant the world to me. And knowing that I had her was such a support to me because I couldn't kill myself when she was dependent on me. I always say that my cat, her name was Princess Kitty, and my journals really saved my life. But I forget to mention my best friend. I met her when I was 11, which I don't think was any sort of coincidence. And I always say she was the first person who taught me how to have a healthy relationship. She really taught me what unconditional love and acceptance look like. And that was really healing, so that even when I hated myself, even when I was hurting myself in so many ways, I was incredibly self-destructive and reckless, I had someone who cared. And that was really helpful for me and powerful. And so by kind of integrating all of these different things, having personal supports, having formal therapy, but then also going to grad school, that really helped me too. Like when I dove into kind of accepting that, I kind of always had this sense since I was 5 years old that I was supposed to be a therapist.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing something on TV and I was like, I think it was a psychiatrist that I saw on TV, but I didn't know the difference.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And so I've always felt called throughout my entire life to help people. And so really, and I forgot to mention this before I went to grad school, in my darkest days, I was always motivated by hope. I knew I was going to help people with my story. And that always drove me to heal, that I had a greater purpose than me. And that was incredibly powerful. And so then when I went to grad school and I fully committed to my purpose, I felt like even though that was incredibly triggering and I didn't know that at the time, and lonely, when I dove into really accepting my purpose and celebrating my gifts in this world, which, I have a gift for healing as well as kind of integrating these modalities that unfortunately I think a lot of psychological speak can kind of be intimidating. And for whatever reason, I can kind of blend it together in a way that people seem to understand. And so really marrying those gifts and then being able to guide people through their healing journey really helped me. And so I think that, of course, not being a healer isn't for everyone, being a therapist isn't for everyone. But I think if people can kind of tap into their authentic gifts and really kind of honor and celebrate their passions rather than think of people, especially people who have had a lot of trauma. Because they don't feel worth it, they almost self-sabotage because they feel like they don't even deserve what's their gift and they question themselves. So if any of your listeners have some sort of idea of what their passion is, but they keep denying it or kind of second guessing it, I want to just encourage them to just lean in and dive into their passions because that is healing. And I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about how celebrating our gifts is actually healing as well.
I don't think we do either. And I think just finding that value in trying to help others. And I'm not saying that everybody has to be a crusader by any means, but I don't know. There's something about recovery that, pulling someone else up, and telling your story, definitely in those first couple of years for me, there are times when you are tempted or you have weakness in you in that moment. And it would be weird and odd, somehow, like you said, no coincidence, someone needs help or you're telling them and then it almost refortifies you. So I agree with you on that. Krystal, can I ask what would be I know you talk about grad school and to me it sounds like maybe that was partially a turning point. Would you say that the lowest point for you in the depths of that pain and I guess just where you are at mentally, was that immediately after moving out? How did it go?
I appreciate that question. I would say I had my darkest days were about a decade.
Okay.
Okay. And I was intensely suicidal for 10 years. My 20s before I went to grad school, those were really painful because not only was I so depressed and recently out of my traumatic childhood home, then I was also just incredibly broke and without meaning and no idea of where my life was going to go. But in grad school, that was triggering. And I moved to Oregon where I didn't know anyone and I'm an Arizonan and that weather was just really hard for me. me to adapt to. And so like the seasonal affect and, and then also, struggling financially during that time, that was very hard. And I had and I was in a very codependent relationship then, as well as before grad school. I was really throughout my those 10 years, I was in very codependent relationships with different men. And then after I came back and I broke up with that man, then I was in some more codependent, like actually even more dysfunctional relationships. Unfortunately, I have found that sometimes in the healing professions, people come with their wounds, but they haven't healed their wounds. And so there's almost more toxicity or pain that kind of gets stirred up. So I had some codependent relationships there. I would really say when it comes to my codependency, my darkest days were, I had an abusive relationship really around the turning point. So for about 4 years on and off, and I haven't been in that for about 3 years.
Okay, so let's talk about that. That's important for me to ask for the listeners because it happens all the time. Actually, one of our guests earlier was someone that just not so long ago got out of a very abusive relationship. And I think those in recovery and trauma suffer from that. So I know that you've had a lot of those and you talked about it, and that's part of your darkest days. So what would you say, like, obviously you do all this coaching, this relationship therapy. What would you say was like the turning point where like now you're not going to those relationships, and how, like, what are the red flags? Like in a shorter version, tell us like how you did that.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So I think that a big red flag that I really overlooked in my own life was that I had a couple people in my life, including my best friend, who really care for me and wanted the best for me. And they would repeatedly, with sorrow, ask me why I was continuing those relationships. But I was so driven to prove my value. Like, these were really emotionally unavailable men. And because of my trauma with my ex-stepfather, in my mind, I was like, if they pick me and if they choose me, then my life is going to have meaning and value. So like, don't tell me that this is wrong. Like, I know this is right. It's just going to work out. And you don't know what he tells me. Yeah. And it's like really nice what he says to me. Don't look at the actions.
Yeah.
And so, but over time in that last abusive relationship, I started to notice like what matters more. And of course, they always say that actions matter more than words. But when you grow up in a very abusive home, but then everyone's always screaming, I love you, like big Italian home. Yeah. I love you all the time. Like, you start to think that
that's normal,
that the words matter just at least as much as the actions. But I started to tell myself like, wait, like I would look at the behaviors that he would do or the things he would do to me or the things he would say, really. And I would say like, well, you can't take that to the bank. And I kind of like was thinking, if I can't take that to the bank, then it means nothing. And then this relationship isn't what I'm imagining it to be in my own fantasy thinking, which codependency is all about the fantasy of who someone is. And like, we're just around the corner of where that big return. And so I think that if in our gut, we really know if someone's right or wrong for us. And I think in our trauma, in our addictions, in our codependency, in our mental health struggles, we just ignore that inner voice. And I don't know about you, April, but I'm sure that there's been a nagging voice inside of you at times. Like, I actually don't know, but I'm sure there's been a nagging voice inside of you at times at different relationships.
Well, it is. And it's funny because I think working with you like has made me start to do that just in all relationships. So like, recently, I've been telling my business development coordinator, like, we'll be talking about even somebody who works for me, and I'll just say, like, well, I don't really care what they said in the meeting. Their actions are showing me something differently. Like, I've really started to place less emphasis on what someone is saying to me, feeding me something all the time, and just watching what they do and the decisions that they make, and really going by that, because that's going to give me, in my opinion, and from what we've done together, the most authentic life is, keeping relationships with people that show up and do what they say they're going to do, ultimately.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to hear that. Like, that brings me a lot of joy. I imagine that's really empowering.
It is. So, okay. So, Krystal, tell us this. What would you tell someone right now, that is trying to navigate in that codependent relationship and maybe even feeling some shame around that and, giving them some hope? What would you tell them about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would first clarify that it makes sense that they feel shame. Shame is like therapist definition over here. Most basically when you feel like you're a bad person.
Yeah.
Guilt is I did a bad thing, which comes up when we are in our addictions or our codependency. Like we do offensive, hurtful things sometimes, but guilt is a teacher. Shame, on the other hand, is this idea that inherently I'm a bad person. And that in of itself is false. That no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've done, you are not inherently a bad person. I think we all have light and shadow. And so maybe there have been experiences that you've acted in more in your shadow rather than your light, but that doesn't define you. What defines you is your ability to heal and make amends and make new choices. And if you have shame because of the things that happened to you, and I know how, yes, not everyone has what we call big T traumas. Big T traumas are like sexual abuse, physical abuse, that kind of stuff. But I don't know of anyone who doesn't have at least some small T traumas that grew up. And trauma just means a wound. So small T traumas could be moving a lot or not having your family support when some people were like bullying you for a short period of time. Ongoing bullying would be a big T trauma. But like just little things that over the years just kind of add up that make us go like, wait, something must be wrong with me. And I'm just going to emphasize there is nothing wrong with you. And that first and foremost, the work is, you're not going to believe that. You're not going to believe there's nothing wrong with you. And so first and foremost is to just kind of lean into hope. You don't have to be completely convinced that recovery is possible. It is. I know that for a fact. But just a little bit of hope. And that hope can kind of guide you to the next step. And maybe the first step is you're listening to this podcast. And that's incredible because we have to kind of fortify ourselves with even the belief that recovery is possible. Because if we think it's impossible, why are we going to take those steps to heal? Because healing is hard work. It is, but I always say the pain of not changing when we're stuck in our trauma and our addictions and our mental health disorders, that pain never goes away. The pain of changing and healing, that eventually subsides. And then we get to an amazing place that, honestly, my life now, I was actually thinking about it recently, is beyond what my greatest dreams for this period of my life had ever been.
I love that. That is really exciting. And I don't know, I think for the listeners, it's sometimes hard to believe that when you're sitting there, if you are right now trapped in an abusive relationship, if you are trapped in your addiction, if you're fighting through relapse, whatever it might be, it's hard to believe that. But the lows that I have had in my addiction, in just my depression over, my childhood trauma have been really low. And I too am in a place where I am living the best life that I possibly could be. But it does require work. And honestly, just the other day, I was really feeling really down and just like overwhelmed and like really not happy about quite a few things. And the pendulum swiveled and it changed. And it kind of just reminded me like you got to ride the waves of life. And so speaking of riding the waves of life, there's things that we do daily to try to stay centered, to stay in our practice, to stay in recovery. What would be 3 daily practices that you utilize to stay centered and have helped you kind of become who you are now, which is this person living the best version of their life they imagined?
Yeah, thank you. So it evolves. I'm going to say that fundamentally, really prioritizing my care is a part of my recovery. And so it evolves how it shows up in my life. So it always looks like, years ago, I realized that really focusing on movement, I don't even like calling it exercise because there's so much stuff around fitness and athleticism. And it's like movement, we're just designed to move our bodies. Movement and nutrition, which really means for me that certain things make me feel happier and certain things make me feel sluggish, which makes me feel irritable and depressed. And so when I focus on nutrition and movement, I feel better. So honestly, I think that's 50% of my depression recovery was just focusing on that. So that never goes away. Do I have days where I have more what I would call like foods that don't make me feel high vibration? Absolutely. I'm human. And I really just, it's a part of my lifestyle now to just really focus on that. Like for me, it's really important to make sure I'm getting my produce. Like I feel better when I do that, when I feel better when I get my fish oil. So I'm really mindful always about those things. Hydration is so important. I have to just say that like it's proven that even slight dehydration in women causes mood issues and mood swings. And so hydration is incredibly important. And then, you know, I have a practice now every morning with my boyfriend. We do yoga in the morning. And so I get my movement and I get some connectivity time with him. Yoga is always about breath more than anything. So I will say it's a practice. I'm not perfect in my recovery. No one is. And so I have to really work hard to connect with my breath. It's not something that is even after all these years. I've had a meditation practice now for 10 years and it's still something I have to work on with the breath, but that's important to me. And then I meditate every night and I just kind of do whatever I feel called to do. And I always like to do a guided meditation on YouTube and I'll just kind of use my intuition to go like, okay, what do I need to work on before I go to bed? And that just really helps quiet my mind because I naturally have a pretty racing mind.
Well, it's funny because I wish I had one to whip out, but I have those crystals and the essential oils. And I went through this stage of having a lot of anxiety and borderline panic attacks. And in our work together, you reminded me to breathe. And so it was actually kind of comical because I'd just be in the middle of things whipping out these essential oils, trying to breathe. But the reality is we need to do whatever we need to do to stay centered. And in addition to that, like, I don't know, I put my recovery first. So if that means you're talking to me and you suddenly see me sniffing essential oils, like that's just what's gonna happen. And I'm comfortable with it.
That's awesome.
But so what I really want to have you tell the listeners about is just like how they can find you. Like you're doing all these things. You're a best-selling author. Obviously, you have your practice. Tell us how they can find you and like really what makes you you today. Like who are you, Krystal?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm so much more than just who I am as a professional,
I know.
You know, and but really like I will say that I feel so much meaning in my work because I chose my life's mission. And so the easiest way for people to find me is at my website, healthyrelationshipfoundation.com. You know, people can really check out my books. You know, I have a couple books on codependency there. They can see that. I have some free resources, really with my blog articles and things like that to help people I actually even teach how to properly deep breathe because if we've gone through a lot of trauma, we don't know that. And so really my website is the best way to connect. I mean, I do therapy and codependency recovery coaching, but I'm really excited right now because I want to help as many people as possible. My vision is actually to have a ripple effect of good in this world. And so I want to help as many people as possible. And so I've created, I'm working on it.
Okay.
A course on self-love. It's actually called Self-Love is Possible, How to Stop Being Your Own Worst Enemy and Become Your Own Best Friend. And I'm going to launch it in August. And, you know, so I'm working through all of that. And so if people are interested in that, where I'm really going to guide people through a 6-week comprehensive system where I learned what actually works. I used to think self-love was just magic. Like, oh, okay, some people just had a fairy godmother and they love themselves. But no, there's actually a system. And that's really exciting to me. So I'm going to guide people through that. If they join the course, they'll have an option for some group coaching sessions as well. And that's what I'm super excited about right now.
Oh, that's awesome, Krystal. And I do know that you're more than just your profession. I think it's probably hard because obviously, you know, I do see you in that light.
Of course.
But so tell us a little bit. So it sounds like you're in a healthy relationship and you're growing. Anything else you want people to know about you before we end this podcast?
Just that the thing that is important to me is that I practice what I preach and that, you know, it is possible to get into recovery. And one thing about me is that, yes, I'm in recovery for codependency, depression, and PTSD. And I'm human. And what I've learned in my recovery is that we get to recovery. And it's kind of like where most days are peaceful and happy and we're grounded, but things are still going to come up. So I want people to know, like, yes, I still actively have things that I work on. But now when I have my triggers, you know, I recently had a big thing that really triggered me in my life. But now I see it and I can lean in and I can go, okay, I see what you are. And instead of kind of coping in all of these ways that are self-destructive, I can now lean in and find all of those things to support me. And one of the biggest things that I'm learning now, because I felt so alone my whole life with my trauma, was that a big part of my healing right now is that it is okay to receive support in an intimate relationship. In codependency, I'm driven by this idea of a relationship that we don't really know how to be intimate. And so I'm really on the greatest adventure of my life, which is learning what real intimacy looks like in practice, not just theory.
I love that. It gives me hope, and it gives probably all the listeners hope too.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Thank you for being on today. It's been a pleasure having you share your story. I feel like I even got to know you a little bit better, which is amazing. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of Abuse Recovery Success. If you want to catch up and just learn more about this podcast, see us start from the beginning, you can check us out at abuserecoverysuccess.com, April_the Hills on Instagram and TikTok, or April Hill Podcast. I appreciate you guys. Have a wonderful day, and I hope this helped you find a little bit of your light on the other side of darkness.
There's no mountain too high for us now. There's no reason to hide. Just let the stars we shine bright. There's no game that's too